Let me greet you all and convey my gratitude at being able to bring you the grade 12s of the Free State this message. The time has come for you to get ready for your final examination at the end of this year. I know this is a daunting task that you are faced with, but let me assure you that with good preparation, determination and discipline, you can get through it with hard work, focus and determination. Grade 12 is your last year of high school and a step towards your future careers. And with that said, you have to make sure you approach your final exams with a goal in mind. Let me tell you that you can do this like your peers have done before you. In 2016 and 2017, the Free State was the top performing province in grade 12, and this you can do again. All you need is a plan. Plan your time. Make sure you start now, because the sooner you start, the better chance you will be able to cover everything in your syllabus and even more content than you have already done. Pay more attention on the subjects which you know that you may be experiencing challenges with. Know your strengths and weaknesses. This will help you to know what you should prioritize. Reflect on your performance throughout the year. Seek help. Asking for help is a very good thing. We cannot all be good at everything. If we have a friend and you know they are good at specific subject, schedule study time with a friend and help each other. Use every possible source of help to improve your weak points. If you are good at something, help your fellow learners and exchange ideas. Your educators can also help. You have libraries, you have your parents and your community, but also you have what other grade 12s in the country don't have at this moment. And this is the Internet Broadcast Project, the IBP. Use this platform, it is very helpful. Here are some tips to help you prepare better in order for you to gain a sustained competitive advantage. 1, start now. The sooner you start, the better. 2, allocate enough time in a day to study. This means spend less time having fun, but having fun with your studies. 3, use previous tests and exam papers. This will help you anticipate what to expect in the exam. 4, form study groups. Make friends with people who can help you and people you can also help. 5, make sure you take breaks between your studies. If your brain is tired, a power nap can help revitalize your concentration. 6, a good diet and drinking enough water will keep you refreshed.
Good morning, learners. My name is MJ Mhlala from Zabelo Pupano Secondary School. Now, we are going to be focusing on the content of Term 3 history part. The main topic is the Scramble for Africa. Now, the subtopics that we have is European colonization of Africa in the late 19th century and the Ashanti Kingdom. Now, moving on, the main concepts that we're going to come across during our lesson is, number 1, colonies. Colonies are areas of land taken over and controlled by another country. Colony is a country that is ruled by foreign power. Now, the next word is inferior, not as good or important as another thing or a person. And then cash crops, crops that are grown to sell rather than to feed the farmer's family. Exile, to be sent away from your country, usually for political reasons. Now, first of all, we're going to focus on Africa before European colonization. Now, how did African people live before European colonization? Now, most of African people lived in small communities that were based on family connections or clans. And then African people had their own economic systems and culture. Now, moving on, we have the map of Africa before European colonization. Now, most of Africa was ruled by traditional chiefs and kings. There were only certain areas in Africa that had contact with Europeans. Now, as you can see on the arrow, we have the Ashanti Kingdom, which we'll be talking about later on during our lesson. Now, moving on, we have map of Africa after the European colonization. Now, this was in 1913. Now, there were only two countries that were still independent in 1913. It was Liberia and Ethiopia. The whole of Africa was colonized except Ethiopia and Liberia. Now, moving on, we are going to talk about the Berlin Conference 1884. Now, by the 1880s, the growing trade between Europe and Africa caused competition between European countries to control this trade. Some European leaders began to think that the competition over Africa might lead to a war between them. Now, to prevent this, Bismarck, the leader of Germany, invited the European countries to discuss ways of dividing up Africa peacefully. Now, the main aim of holding this conference, the Berlin Conference, was to divide Africa peacefully amongst the European countries. Now, representatives from 15 countries attended the Berlin Conference, but not a single leader from Africa was invited to attend. Now, moving on, here we have the results of the Berlin Conference. European countries competed to grab parts of Africa quickly. By 1913, the whole of Africa was divided up into colonies, except Ethiopia and Liberia. The rights of African people were ignored. Now, the causes of colonization. What was the causes or the reasons that made Africa to be colonized by Europeans? Now, the first one is that Europeans saw Africa as a place where they could sell products. Sell products how? Let us see. Now, European factories were producing so much goods that people in Europe could not buy all of the products. Now, European factories saw Africa as a large new market where they could sell their products. Now, the first cause of colonization was that Africa was a place where Europe could sell products. Two, Africa was a place where Europeans could get raw materials. Now, when you look at it, new factories in Europe realized that there were some raw materials that could not grow in Europe. So therefore, they hoped that they could get the raw materials in Africa or grow them in Africa. I'll repeat. New factories in Europe realized that there are some raw materials that could not grow in Europe. So therefore, they were hoping to get them or grow them in Africa. Some of these raw materials include cotton, cocoa, and sugar. They needed to make these products. So number two, the cause of colonization, we have Africa was a place where Europe could get raw materials. Three, Africa was a place where Europe could get mineral wealth. How? Let us look at it. Now, after the discovery of gold and diamond in Southern Africa, Europeans thought that they could get some valuable minerals in other parts of Africa. That is why they decided to go and colonize the whole of Africa. So that's number three. Africa was a place where Europe could get mineral wealth. Now, four, investors could make money in Africa. Europeans wanted to invest money in new developments in Africa rather than in Europe. They were hoping that these investments could bring more money and make them more profits. Now, number four, the cause of colonization is that investors thought that they could make money in Africa. Now, the fifth cause of colonization, colonies could provide food and space. Now, what happened is that this part of colonies could provide food and space. Europeans realized that there is a lot of space in Africa, so they wanted to get more space so that they can have more food supplies. And they also encouraged other Europeans to go and live in Africa. This could help them to with the overcrowding in Europe, and it was going to help them with unemployment in Europe. So that's number 5, the cause of colonization. Colonies could provide food and space. Now let us recap on the causes of colonization. 1, Africa was a place where Europeans could get raw materials. 2, Africa was a place where Europeans could sell products. 3, Africa was a place where Europeans could get mineral wealth. 4, investors could make money in Africa. 5, colonies could provide food and space. Now, those are the reasons or the causes why Africa was colonized and why Europeans came to Africa. Now, moving on, we are moving to the patterns of colonization. Which countries colonized which parts of Africa? Now, 1, Britain. Britain was the main colonial power. Britain was the main colonial power in Africa. They colonized South Africa, Botswana, Malawi, Sudan, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda. They are the ones who fought hard to get many parts in Africa. Now, 2, we have France. The French colonial empire was the second largest after the British Empire. Their colonies included Senegal and Niger. Now, 3, the Germans colonized Tanzania and Namibia. Now, as we move on, why European powers were able to colonize Africa so quickly? Now, that's the main question. When you look at it, there are some things that Europeans had that Africans did not have. That is why they managed to colonize Africa so quickly. Now, let us look at what did Europeans have? What made them to have an advantage in colonizing Africa? Let us look at the first one. First one, better transport made colonization possible. They had better transport. During the Industrial Revolution, new railways and steamships were invented. Now, they had this kind of transport. So it was easier for them to trade and to colonize Africa. It was because, 1, they had better transport. 2, why were European powers able to colonize Africa so quickly? Number 2, better weapons. Europeans invented deadly weapons that gave them an advantage to African armies, because African armies did not have any of this. The Europeans are the one that implemented deadly machine guns. So when they came to Africa, they were in a more advantageous position. So therefore, they were able to defeat the African armies. Now, number 3, this is the one that gave them the most advantage. Divisions in African society. African kingdoms were so divided, they were not united. So you know that even when you are not united as a group or as a country, it is easier for someone outside to destroy you. But when you are solid and united, if only African kingdoms were united, maybe we could have been talking another story by now. Number 3, the cause of colonization was divisions in African society. Africans were not united. They even had wars between them sometimes. They had competitions. They were not united. So Europeans took this advantage. Now, to recap, why were European powers able to colonize Africa so quickly? One, we have better transport. 2, better weapons. 3, divisions in African society. Now, moving on, results of colonization. What happened after Africa was colonized? Let us check. Political results of colonization. Europeans divided Africa by making borders between different colonies. That is why we have borders now. It was one of the results of colonization. We have borders of Lesotho, borders of Mozambique, border of Zimbabwe. That is why we have borders. It was the result of colonization. The key word of this political result is that if you want to remember more quickly, you should know that political results of colonization. 1, we have borders that were made between different colonies. 2, colonial governments implemented or passed laws to keep Africans in an inferior position. They were forced to live separated lives. If you remember those laws, we can talk about many of them. The Group Areas Act, the Separate Amenities. We have many of those laws that kept African people in an inferior position. They lived separated lives. Moving on, we have economic results of colonization. Now, Africans were forced to make way for colonial farms and plantations growing cash crops. Africans were forced to make ways in farms that they have been farming for generations, but they were forced to make way for colonial farms, for growing cash crops. If you remember, in the beginning of our lesson, we talked about cash crops. Cash crops are the crops that are grown to sell rather than to feed the farmer's family. Now, after a while, African people could not grow enough food to even feed themselves. Moving on, the raw materials such as rubber and cotton and minerals such as diamonds, gold, and copper that European powers got from Africa made them very wealthy. Africa did not benefit from any of this. Now, Africans started to buy manufactured goods from Europe instead of making their own. Now, moving on, we have cultural results of colonization. Europeans thought that African art, traditions, and knowledge were not as developed as their own. They brought their own languages, such as English, French, and Portuguese, and forced people to use them. They changed the names of places and gave them European names. Now, you can think of that. They brought their own languages. That is why we have languages like English, French, and Portuguese, and even Afrikaans. Now, moving on, the Europeans also brought benefits to Africa. We must not forget. The Europeans also brought benefits to Africa. They introduced Western education, medicine, and technology, and introduced sports such as soccer and cricket. Those were the results of colonization. Now, just to recap on them, we have results of colonization. We have economic results. We have political results. We have cultural results. Now, moving on. The next subtopic, the Ashanti Kingdom. If you remember, on the map of Africa before colonization, there was an arrow that was pointing on the Ashanti Kingdom. And I told you that we'll be talking about the Ashanti Kingdom later on during the lesson. The Ashanti Kingdom. Now, the picture that you see is the golden stool. We'll talk about the golden stool as we go on with our lesson. The Ashanti Kingdom and their early contact with European traders and explorers. Now, the first king of the Ashanti Kingdom was Osei Tutu. Now, the most important thing about Osei Tutu, this is the question that I will ask. What did Osei Tutu do to form a strong union at the Ashanti Kingdom? Now, Osei Tutu joined a number of Akan states to form a strong union and ruled it from the Ashanti capital at Kumasi. The first king was who? The first king was Osei Tutu. Now, the most important symbol of the king's power was the golden stool. Now, the Ashanti believed that this golden stool represented the soul of the nation and brought good fortune to it. Now, as we continue, the Ashanti Kingdom became very wealthy, especially after traders from Europe arrived to trade with West Africa. The Ashanti did not trade directly with the Europeans, but with the people living at the coast who acted as go-betweens. Now, when you talk of go-betweens, these people who were living at the coast, the Ashanti people were giving gold to them, and then the go-betweens would take the gold to Europe. And then they would usually get metals such as copper, and then they would get clothes, they would get guns in exchange. Now, moving on, since the Ashanti did not trade directly with the Europeans, there were these Europeans that decided that no, we want to trade directly with the Ashanti people. Now, who were the first Europeans to arrive at the Ashanti Kingdom? The first European traders to arrive were the Portuguese. What was the reason? Why did the Portuguese come to the Ashanti Kingdom? Now, the Portuguese wanted to buy gold directly from West Africa. Therefore, a local Akan leader gave the Portuguese permission to build a fort on the coast, which was called Elmina, the mine in English. Now, when you look at it, the local leader of the Ashanti Kingdom gave so much advantage to Europeans, to these people, since he gave them permission to build a fort. We will I will later tell you about what happened to this Elmina. What happened to the what was the cause of the downfall of the Ashanti Kingdom? Remember, I want you to remember this. A local Akan leader gave the Portuguese permission to build a fort on the coast. Now, the Portuguese bought gold and ivory in exchange for metals such as brass and copper, and then cloth and guns. Now, remember, a local Akan leader gave permission to the Portuguese. As time goes on, the Dutch took over the Elmina from the Portuguese, and the British built their own fort at the Cape Coast. Now, the Ashanti became the main source of gold and slaves for the European traders. Now, the Ashanti had a large and well-trained army. Now, the Ashanti Kingdom was very strong, since they sold gold and then in exchange they got guns. So therefore, they had a large and a very strong army that was well-trained. So it was not easy for the Europeans to just come and colonize the Ashanti Kingdom. It was not easy because they were fighting back. They had guns. They already had guns that they got from selling gold to the Portuguese. Now, the British and the colonization of the Gold Coast. Now, let us continue. During the 1800s, the British fought many wars against the Ashanti Kingdom. Now, they wanted control of the trade routes. Why did the British fight against the Ashanti Kingdom? It's because they wanted the control of the trade routes and also wanted to stop the trade in slaves. Now, let us look at this. Remember we said that the Ashanti Kingdom had a well-trained army, a strong army. When the British attacked Kumasi in 1824, the Ashanti were able to defeat them simply because they had a very strong army. You will come across a question maybe later on that says, what is the difference between the invasions of 1824 and 1874? Now, this is 1824. When the British attacked Kumasi in 1824, the Ashanti were able to defeat them. Moving on, the British took over Elmina. Remember, I said to you to highlight that. I said to you, you must remember that a local Akan leader gave permission for the Portuguese to build a fort. This fort was taken over by the Dutch, and then later on, it was taken by the British. Now, after the British took over the Elmina from the Dutch in 1874, they were in a more powerful position to be able to attack the Ashanti people. They were in a more powerful position now because they were living amongst the Ashanti people. The British took over the Elmina from the Dutch. In 1874, they attacked Kumasi and took many of the Ashanti golden works of art and blew up the king's palace. How horrible. The Ashanti kingdom was still independent, but slowly became weaker. Remember how the Ashanti kingdom was. Remember how strong the Ashanti kingdom was. But after the British blew up the king's palace, the Ashanti kingdom was still independent, but it slowly became weaker. Now, moving on. In the 1890s, a new Ashanti king, Prempe I, began to reunite the Ashanti kingdom. Prempe I was a new king after Osei Tutu. Remember, the first king was Osei Tutu. Now, a new Ashanti king after Osei Tutu was Prempe I. Like I said, after the king's palace was blew up, the Ashanti kingdom slowly became weaker. Now, Prempe I began to reunite the Ashanti kingdom. Now, the British did not want this to happen. They arrested Prempe and sent him into exile in the Seychelles. Remember, we talked about exile. What is exile? Exile is when a person is sent away from his or her home country in order for political reasons. Exile, when someone is sent away from his or her home country due to political reasons. The British did not want this to happen. Now, after this, they demanded that the Ashanti pay them a huge amount of gold and hand over the golden stool. The Ashanti did not the Ashanti did not want this to happen. The Ashanti refused and decided to hide the golden stool. You must remember, the golden stool was the symbol of the king's power. Now, the British wanted the Ashanti people to hand over the golden stool, but the Ashanti people refused and decided to hide the golden stool. Now, as we continue, while the British were looking for the golden stool, the Ashanti made a final attempt to resist a British takeover their kingdom. They decided to fight for the last time. They decided to put everything on the line and told themselves that we are going to make a final attempt so that our kingdom cannot be colonized or become a British colony. Now, although they managed to hide the golden stool, in 1902 they were defeated and became a British colony. Now, when you look at it, I will just quickly go back. While the British were looking for the golden stool, the Ashanti made a final attempt to resist a British takeover their kingdom. The resistance was led by the Queen Mother, Ya Asentewa. Now, although they managed to hide the golden stool, in 1902 they were defeated and became a British colony. Queen Ya Asentewa was also sent into exile to the Seychelles, where she died in 1921. Now, moving on, is the results of colonization for the Ashanti Kingdom in Britain. Now, the Ashanti Kingdom became part of the colony called the Gold Coast. The British usually ruled their countries through local leaders, and so they allowed the exiled king Prempe I to return. Although he returned and became king, but he did not have any real powers. In the Gold Coast, British companies took over the gold mines and bought the main crop, cocoa beans, and sent them to factories in Britain to be made into chocolate. Now, as we continue, the Gold Coast remained a colony until 1957, when it became an independent country of Ghana. Now, Ghana got its independence in 1957. It was the first African colony to become independent. Now, the golden stool and other items are at the museum in Kumasi and are the reminders of their proud history. Now, these are the questions that you will work through and get the answers. I hope you have had a very good lesson and you have learned so much on the two topics, the European colonization and then the Ashanti Kingdom. Thank you, learners. Have a good day.